It is story of March 1945. New York Harbor. A cold Atlantic wind swept across the docks before sunrise. Dark clouds hung low over the water. The harbor smelled of salt, diesel fuel, wet wood, and coal smoke drifting from distant ships. Tugboats groaned through the morning fog. Chains rattled. Seagulls screamed overhead. And slowly, through the gray mist, a transport ship approached the pier. Few people on the dock paid much attention. Thousands of military vessels had arrived here during the war. This one seemed no different. But hidden inside were women carrying a secret fear. German women. Enemy nationals. Women who had spent years listening to stories about America. Stories that painted Americans as monsters. Stories that claimed American soldiers hated Germans with a burning passion. Stories that promised humiliation, revenge, and punishment. Now they were finally here. And every one of them expected the worst. The ship bumped against the pier. Metal groaned against metal. Ropes were thrown. Orders echoed across the deck. The women stood silently. No one spoke. No one smiled. Most stared at the floor. Many looked exhausted. Months of uncertainty had carved deep shadows beneath their eyes. Their coats were worn and faded. Their shoes were scuffed. The cold wind cut through the thin fabric and sent shivers through their bodies. Some held small bags containing everything they owned. Others had nothing at all. As the gangway lowered, a strange silence settled over the group. This was the moment they had feared. The moment they had imagined countless times. Several women later admitted they believed imprisonment would be only the beginning. They expected insults. Interrogations. Perhaps worse. One woman quietly crossed herself. Another squeezed a photograph hidden inside her coat pocket. A third stared toward the dock and whispered a prayer. The gangway touched the pier. The journey was over. Or perhaps something entirely new was about to begin. American military personnel waited below. The women froze. Their hearts pounded. Boots echoed against the metal ramp as the first prisoners slowly descended. The harbor wind whipped through their hair. Nobody knew what would happen next. Then something unexpected occurred. Nobody shouted. Nobody struck them. Nobody cursed them. The Americans simply watched. Calmly. Professionally. Almost indifferently. The reaction confused many of the women. This was not what they had been taught to expect. Not even close. Yet the biggest surprise was still waiting. Because after processing and registration, the women were escorted toward a reception building near the docks. Inside, the air felt warm compared to the bitter cold outside. The smell hit them immediately. Fresh coffee. Soap. Clean fabric. Food. Simple smells. Ordinary smells. But to people who had lived through years of war, they felt almost unreal. Some women exchanged nervous glances. Others stared at the floor. It is a story of March 1945. Not dangerous. New York just strange. A cold Atlantic wind swept across the docks into a different sunrise. Then they noticed clouds hung low, a large object standing against the wall. Salt, diesel fuel, shiny wood, and completely unfamiliar. Distant ships. The women tugboats groaned. Several stopped walking altogether. Chains rattled. One pointed toward it. Screamed overhead. Another frowned. And slowly, a third through the gray mist, closer. A transport ship approached the pier. Someone whispered in German. Few people on the dock paid much attention. Because nobody knew military vessels had arrived here during the war. To every American in the room, no different. Yet to these women, but hidden inside, it might as well have come from another secret fear. They stared at it. Women, confused, enemy nationals, curious, women who had spent years listening to stories whether it was military equipment, stories that painted Americans served some industrial purpose, stories that claimed American soldiers it might be part of a communication system. Stories that promised humiliation for processing paperwork and punishment. Every theory sounded reasonable. Every theory one of them expected the worst. An American soldier noticed their confusion. A smile appeared on his face. Not a mocking smile. Orders not echoed a cruel across the deck. A genuine smile of surprise. No one realized immediately what had smiled. The women surrounding the object had absolutely no idea what they were looking at. Months of uncertainty had carved two worlds collided beneath their eyes. That small room. Their coats were worn, shaped by years of scarcity. Their shoes were scuffed, rationing. The cold wind cut through the thin fabric shaped by industrial abundance that had continued growing. Some held small bags containing everything between those worlds. Others not be measured in miles. As the gangway lowered, a strange silence settled over the group. Kept staring. This was the moment the soldier walked closer. The moment they had imagined next would become one of the most unexpected memories of their committed, they believed imprisonment would be only the beginning. Why a simple everyday object could create such confusion. Interrogations. We need to go back. Perhaps worse. Back before New York woman Harbor. Quietly crossed herself. Before the ship. Another squeezed a photograph surrender hidden inside her coat pocket. Back to a Germany stared toward the beneath the weight of war. Prayer. Because the rail story begins years earlier. The nation where millions of people were learning to survive entirely new was about to begin. And as conditions grew worse, military personnel waited one day a simple object in America would leave them their hearts pounded. Boots echoed against the metal ramp as the first prisoners slowly descended. The harbor wind whipped through their hair. Nobody knew what would happen next. Then something unexpected occurred. Nobody shouted. Nobody struck them. Nobody cursed them. The Americans simply watched. Calmly. Professionally. Almost indifferently. The reaction confused many of the women. This was not what they had been taught to expect. Not even close. Yet the biggest surprise was still waiting. Because after processing and registration, the women were escorted toward a reception building near the docks. Inside, the air felt warm compared to the bitter cold outside. The smell hit them immediately. Fresh coffee. Soap. Clean fabric. Food. Simple smells. Ordinary smells. But to people who had lived through years of war, they felt almost unreal. Some women exchanged nervous glances. Others stared at the floor. To understand the mystery that unfolded inside that reception building, New York, we have to travel back a cold Atlantic wind swept across the docks before sunrise. Back to a nation consumed by war. Low over the water. By 1943, the harbor smelled of daily life across much of Germany had begun to change dramatically. Drifting from distant ships, many civilians tried to maintain a sense of normality. Chains rattled, remained open. Seagulls screamed overhead, continued operating, and slowly through the gray mist worked day and night. A transport ship approached propaganda posters still promised victory, paid much attention. Beneath the surface, thousands of military vessels had arrived here during the war. Became harder to find. This one seemed basic household goods, but hidden inside were women carrying a secret fear. Was replaced by substitutes. Enemy nationals became a luxury. Women who had spent years listening to stories about America faster than it could be replaced. That painted Americans families as learned monsters. To repair old items stories again that claimed American soldiers hated Germans with a burning passion. Every scrap stories that promised humiliation. Life became a constant battle against shortages. Now they were finally here. They stood in long lines. Every one of them expected the worst. Sometimes they waited hours only to return home empty-handed against metal. The smell of fresh bread became increasingly rare. Orders echoed across the deck. Full store. The women stood silently. Even simple comforts disappeared. No one smiled. And then came the bombing. Stared at the floor. At first, many looked exhausted. Stories of uncertainty from other cities had carved deep shadows beneath their eyes. Their coats were worn between neighbors. Their shoes were arrived overhead. The cold wind cut through the thin fabric and sent shivers through their bodies. Their haunting wail some held small bags containing everything day or night. Others meals nothing were interrupted. As the gangway lowered, a strange conversation settled over the group instantly. This was the moment they had feared and rushed underground. They had imagined inside crowded shelters. Several women later admitted they believed imprisonment would be only the beginning. Mothers whispered prayers. They expected insults. Dust drifted from interrogations as explosions shook the ground above. One woman nobody knew whether their home would still exist. Another squeezed a photograph for countless inside her coat pocket. These experiences became toward the dock and whispered was no longer an emotion. The gangway touched the pier. It was a permanent companion. The journey was over. But something even stranger entirely new was about to begin. The image they had been given of military personnel increasingly distorted. The government propaganda portrayed Americans as ruthless enemies. Boots echoed against the metal ramp speeches as the first prisoners slowly repeated the same message. The harbor wind Americans were dangerous. Nobody knew what would happen next. Germans. Then Americans would show no mercy. Nobody appeared everywhere. Nobody struck them. Eventually, many people accepted it as the Americans simply after hearing something enough times, professionally becomes difficult, almost indifferent. And yet reality was preparing a very different many of the women. As the war entered its final stages, Germany's situation deteriorated rapidly. Yet the entire cities lay in ruins. Transportation processing and registration, fuel shortages toward a reception building. Millions of civilians found themselves displaced. The air felt warm. The winter of 1944 and early 1945 was especially harsh. Fresh cold winds swept through damaged buildings. Clean fabric, broken windows were covered with blankets and cardboard. Ordinary smells became precious. But to people who had lived through years of whatever they could find, they felt almost unreal. Furniture. Some women exchanged nervous glances that produced heat. Others stared at the floor. The smell of smoke hung over many neighborhoods. Hunger followed close behind. Meals grew smaller. It is a story of March 1945. Red portions shrank. New York Harbor. Mothers worried a cold Atlantic wind feeding their children. The docks before sunrise. Every day felt uncertain. Dark clouds hung low over the water. Temporary. The harbor smelled of salt, diesel fuel, In early 1945, drifting from front lines ships moved rapidly. Tugboats groaned news through the morning from every direction. Chains rattled. Cities were falling. Seagulls screamed. Armies overhead were retreating. And slowly, the war through the gray mist, a transport ship approached the pier. Relief. Few people on the dock paid much attention because surrender meant of military vessels had arrived, and many German civilians feared what would happen next. No different. Among them were women who would eventually find themselves transported across the Atlantic. Women. Some had worked in administrative positions. Women who had spent years had served in support organizations. America. Others simply became caught Americans in the chaos of a collapsing nation. Stories that claimed individual stories hated Germans, but they shared one thing. Stories that promised humiliation. Nobody knew what tomorrow would bring. Now they were finally here, impossible to predict. Every one of them expected when they entered Allied custody. The ship anxiety followed them everywhere. Metal rumors spread quickly among prisoners. Ropes were thrown. Stories circulated through camps across the temporary holding centers. The women stood silently. Some claimed Americans treated prisoners harshly. No one smiled. Others claimed conditions were fair. At the floor. Nobody knew what to exhausted. Information of uncertainty had carved deep shadows beneath their eyes. Speculation. Their coats were worn and faded, and their shoes usually won. The cold wind cut through the thin fabric and sent shivers through their orders arrived. Some held small bags would be transported overseas. Others to America. Had nothing at all. The announcement as the gangway many of the women. A strange America settled over the name itself carried enormous emotional weight. For years they had imagined countless times as an enemy nation. Several women later admitted they believed imprisonment would be only the beginning. The voyage began under gray skies. As the transport ship pulled away from Europe, many passengers crowded along the rails. Crossed herself. Some stared silently at the disappearing coastline inside her coat pocket. Others cried. A third stared toward the dock goodbye and whispered a prayer. Not because they expected anyone to see them. The journey was they did not know if they would ever return. Entirely new was about to begin. Was long. American military personnel waited below. Days blended together. Froze. Cold winds swept across the decks. Boots echoed against the metal ramp as the first prisoners slowly descended. Mixed with seawater. The harbor wind whipped metal surfaces groaned constantly. Nobody knew what would happen next. At night, then something unexpected across the horizon. Nobody shouted. Many women spent hours talking quietly. Nobody cursed them. Sharing fears. The Americans simply sharing memories. Calmly. Sharing rumors. Professionally. Again almost and again the same questions. The reaction confused. What would America be like? This was not what they had been taught to expect. Would they ever see home again? Not even close. Nobody had answers. The biggest surprise and the uncertainty felt worse because than any processing and registration. One evening, the women were escorted toward a reception building near the docks. An older woman described stories she had heard. The air felt warm compared to the bitter cold outside. American cities filled with electric lights. Immediately. Stories about stores overflowing with products. Clean fabric. Stories about endless abundance. Simple smells. Several listeners laughed nervously. But to people who had lived through years of war, they felt almost unreal. How could any nation possess such wealth while Europe struggled simply to survive? At the floor. The conversation faded. Most dismissed the tales. Soon they would discover those stories had not been exaggerated at all. The first glimpse of America arrived before dawn. Passengers gathered on deck despite the cold. The harbor slowly emerged through fog. Buildings appeared. Ships. Cranes. Lights. The scale of everything seemed enormous. Industrial. Powerful. For women arriving from war-ravaged Europe, the sight felt almost unreal. Nothing appeared damaged. Nothing appeared broken. There were no bomb craters. No collapsed buildings. No shattered streets. The contrast was impossible to ignore. Some stared silently. Others exchanged bewildered looks. One woman reportedly whispered, "It looks untouched." Because it was. While Europe had burned, America had remained largely beyond the reach of destruction. That story would soon become impossible to miss. New York after disembarking, a cold Atlantic wind swept across the docks before sunrise. Identification checks, dark clouds hung low examinations. The harbor smelled of procedures, diesel fuel. Yet even during these first hours, smoke the women noticed details that caught their attention. Groaned through the morning fog. Bright lights rattled. Fresh seagulls screamed overhead. Equipment and slowly through the gray mist, ordinary transport ship approached the pier. That had become increasingly rare in wartime Germany. At thousands of military vessels had arrived here isolated examples. This one perhaps the Americans were merely presenting a favorable women carrying a secret evidence accumulated everywhere. Enemy nationals seemed generous. Women who had spent years listening to stories about America. The supplies stories that painted Americans. The women struggled to reconcile stories that claimed American soldiers everything they had expected with a burning passion. Then came the moment that nobody promised humiliation. Inside the reception area stood a large machine. Now they were finally here, polished, and every one of them expected by American standards. The ship bumped against the pier, completely unfamiliar to many of the women staring at it. Ropes they gathered around, orders examining every detail. The women
trying to
stood
understand
silently.
its purpose.
No one spoke.
What is it?
No one
The question
smiled.
spread through
Most
the group.
stared at the floor.
Nobody knew.
Many looked
One woman
exhausted.
suggested it might
Months of
distribute
uncertainty
paperwork.
had carved deep
Another
shadows
guessed
beneath
it
their
stored
eyes.
military equipment.
Their coats were worn
A third
and
believed
faded.
it was some
Their
kind of
shoes were
communication
scuffed.
device.
The cold
The
wind
theories
cut through the thin
multiplied,
fabric and sent
none were
shivers through
correct.
their bodies.
American
Some
personnel
held small
watched
bags
with
containing
growing
everything
amusement.
they owned.
Not because
Others
the
had
women
nothing
seemed
at all.
foolish,
As the
because
gangway
they
lowered,
genuinely
a
had
strange
no
frame
silence
of reference
settled over the group.
The machine was
This
a
was the
vending
moment
machine.
they had feared.
A simple vending
the moment
machine.
they had imagined
A countless
countless times
throughout much of America.
Several women later
Insert
admitted
a
they
coin.
believed imprisonment
Receive
would be
a
only
product.
the beginning.
The concept
They expected
seemed obvious
insults,
to Americans.
interrogations.
But for women who had spent
Perhaps
years in a
worse.
nation consumed
One
by
woman
shortages,
quietly
rationing,
crossed herself.
destruction,
Another
and scarcity,
squeezed a photograph
the idea felt
hidden
astonishing.
inside her coat pocket.
A machine that
A third
automatically
stared
dispensed
toward the
food
dock
or
and
goods.
whispered a prayer.
Without standing
gangway
in line,
touched the pier.
without ration
The journey
cards,
was over.
without
Or
shortages,
perhaps something
the
entirely
very
new
concept
was about to
challenged
begin.
their recent experiences.
American military personnel
Some stared
waited
in
below.
disbelief.
The women
Others
froze.
laughed nervously.
Their hearts pounded.
One reportedly
Boots
asked whether the
echoed
machine
against the metal
actually
ramp
worked.
as the first prisoner
An American
slowly
demonstrated.
The harbor
The women
wind
watched
whipped through their
closely.
hair.
A coin
Nobody
dropped.
knew what would happen
A mechanical
next.
click echoed
Then something
inside.
unexpected
Moments
occurred.
later, an
Nobody
item appeared.
shouted.
Simple.
Nobody struck them.
Ordinary.
Nobody
Routine.
cursed them.
Yet
the
the
Americans
reaction was
simply watched.
extraordinary. Calmly,
For a few seconds,
professionally,
nobody spoke.
Almost indifferently.
The machine represented
the reaction
something larger
confused
than
many
itself.
of the women.
It represented
this was not
abundance,
what they had been taught to
choice,
expect.
convenience,
Not even close.
a world untouched
Yet the
by
biggest
years
surprise
of desperate
was still
scarcity.
waiting. And
Because
the surprises
after processing
were only
and
beginning.
registration,
Because
the women
what
were
happened
escorted
over the
toward a
following
reception
weeks
building
would challenge
challenged
even more assumptions.
Inside,
Many
the air
of the
felt
women
warm
arrived
compared to the bitter
expecting
cold
hatred.
outside.
The
Instead,
smell
they
hit them
encountered
immediately.
professionalism, fresh
Some
coffee,
expected
soap,
punishment.
clean
Instead,
fabric,
they received
food,
medical care.
simple
Some
smells,
expected humiliation.
ordinary smells.
Instead,
But
they
to people who had
experienced
lived
ordinary
through years
human
of war,
interactions.
they felt almost
Not
unreal.
perfect. Some
Not
women
idealized,
exchanged nervous
not
glances.
free from tension.
Others stared
but
at the
far
floor.
different from what they had imagined. Each day created new contradictions. Each day forced them to reconsider old beliefs. And the real surprise had not yet arrived. Because beyond the vending machines, the clean facilities, and the abundant supplies, they would soon discover something even more difficult to understand. The possibility that the enemy they had feared for years might not be the enemy they had imagined at all. It is story
turned
of
into
March
months.
1945. The strange machine that had once
New York
gathered a crowd
Harbor.
of confused
A cold
German women
Atlantic
gradually
wind swept
became
across
just
the
another
docks
part
before
of daily
sunrise.
life.
The
Dark
mystery
clouds
had
hung
been
low
solved.
over the water.
The curiosity
the harbor
had
smelled
faded.
of salt, diesel
But the
fuel,
memory remained.
wet wood, and coal
Years
smoke
later,
drifting
many
from
of those
distant
women
ships.
would forget the
Tugboats
names of
groaned
buildings.
through the morning
They
fog.
would forget dates.
Chains rattled.
They would forget
seagulls
certain conversations.
screamed overhead.
Yet some
And
never
slowly,
forgot
through
that
the gray
first
mist,
moment of
a
confusion.
transport ship approached
The moment
the
they
pier.
stood before an
Few people
ordinary
on the
American
dock
vending
paid
machine
much attention
and realized they had
Thousands
entered a world
of military
completely
vessels
different from
had
the one
arrived
they had
here
known
during the war.
At first glance,
this one
it seemed
no
like a
different.
small story,
but hidden
a
inside
simple
were women
misunderstanding,
carrying a secret
a
fear.
cultural surprise.
German women,
Nothing
enemy
more.
nationals,
But beneath the surface,
women who had
it
spent
revealed
years
something
listening
much
to stories
larger.
about America.
The machine itself
stories
was never
that
the
painted
real
Americans
story.
as monsters.
The real story was
stories
what it
that claimed
represented.
American soldiers
For
hated
years,
Germans
these
with a
women
burning
had lived
passion.
inside a country
Stories that
consumed
promised
by war.
humiliation. They had
Revenge
watched shortages
and punishment.
spread across Germany.
Now they were finally
They had
here.
stood in ration
And every
lines.
one of them
They had
expected
searched
the worst.
empty shelves.
The ship bumped
They had learned
against
to
the
repair
pier.
old clothing
Metal
instead of
groaned
buying new
against
garments.
metal.
They had
Ropes were
measured
thrown.
food carefully.
Orders echoed
Saved
across
scraps
the deck.
carefully.
The women
Planned
stood
every
silently.
meal carefully.
No one spoke.
Scarcity shaped
No
their
one
daily
smiled.
lives.
Most
Every
stared
decision
at the floor.
involved limitation.
Many looked exhausted.
Every comfort
Months
became
of uncertainty
precious.
had carved
Every
deep
possession
shadows
carried
beneath their
value.
eyes.
Then
Their
they
coats
arrived
were worn
in America
and faded,
and suddenly
their
they
shoes
encountered
were
a
scuffed.
society
The
operating
cold wind
under
cut
completely
through the
different
thin
conditions
fabric
and sent shivers
a society
through their
where
bodies.
machines
Some
dispensed
held
products
small bags
automatically,
containing everything
where
they owned.
stores remained
Others
stocked,
had nothing at
where
all.
factories
As the
continued
gangway
producing
lowered,
goods on a
a
massive
strange
scale,
silence settled
where
over the
abundance
group.
existed
This was
in
the
ways
moment they had
never
feared.
imagined.
The moment
The
they had
contrast
imagined
was impossible
countless
to
times.
ignore.
Several
Yet
women
material
later admitted
abundance
they
was
believed
only part of the
imprisonment would
surprise.
be only the beginning.
Something even
They
more
expected
important happened
insults,
during their time in
interrogation,
American
custody.
Perhaps
Slowly,
worse.
many
One
began
woman
questioning the
quietly
image
crossed
they had been
herself.
taught to believe.
Another squeezed
For years
a photograph
they had heard
hidden
stories
inside her
describing
coat
Americans
pocket.
as
A
cruel
third
enemies.
stared toward the dock
They had
and
expected
whispered a prayer.
hatred.
The
They had
gangway
expected
touched the pier.
revenge. The
Some
journey
had
was
expected
over.
violence.
Or perhaps something something
Instead,
entirely
they
new
encountered
was about
something
to begin.
far more complicated.
American military
Not
personnel
perfection.
waited below.
Not universal
the women
kindness.
froze. Not
Their
a
hearts
fairy tale.
pounded.
But
Boots
ordinary
echoed
human
against
beings.
the metal ramp as the
Guards
first
who
prisoners
followed
slowly
regulations.
descended.
The
Medical
harbor wind
workers
whipped
who
through
treated
their
illnesses.
hair. Nobody knew what
Administrators
would
who
happen
processed
next.
paperwork.
Then something
Soldiers who
unexpected
exchanged
occurred.
brief
Nobody
conversations.
shouted.
People who,
Nobody struck
despite
them.
being wartime
Nobody
enemies,
cursed them.
often behaved in
The
ways
Americans
that contradicted
simply watched.
years of propaganda.
Calmly.
This
Professionally,
realization was not
almost
immediate.
indifferently.
Old beliefs
The reaction
rarely disappear
confused
overnight.
many of the women.
Nation they
Inside
returned
were
to
women
was
carrying
rebuilding
a secret
from
fear.
ruins.
German
Cities
women
required
enemy
reconstruction.
nationals,
Families
women
searched
who had
for
spent
missing
years
relatives,
listening to stories
entire
about
communities
America,
struggled to create
stories
new
that
futures
painted
from the
Americans
wreckage of
as
war.
monsters.
The process
Stories
would take
that claimed
years.
American
For
soldiers
some,
hated Germans
decades.
with a burning passion.
Yet memories of America
Stories that
remained
promised
part of their
humiliation,
personal histories,
revenge, and
not
punishment.
because of grand
now they were
political
finally
speeches,
here,
not
and
because
every one of them
military
expected the
victories,
worst,
but
the
because
ship
of
bumped
simple
against the
experiences
pier.
that challenged
Metal groaned
deeply held
against
belief.
metal. History
Ropes
books
were
often
thrown.
focus on
Orders
battles,
echoed across the
generals,
deck. The women
strategies,
stood silently.
governments,
No one
and
spoke.
those subjects
No
mattered.
one smiled.
But sometimes the most revealing
stared at the
stories
floor.
occur far
Many
away
looked
from battlefields.
exhausted.
Months of
Sometimes
uncertainty
history
had
turns
carved
quietly.
deep shadows beneath their
Inside
eyes.
a reception center.
Their coats were worn
Inside
and
a
faded.
conversation.
Their shoes
Inside
were
a
scuffed.
moment of confusion.
The cold wind cut
A
through
woman
the thin
staring
fabric
at a machine
and sent
and
shivers
asking
through their
a simple
bodies.
question.
Some held
What is
small
this?
bags containing
The answer
everything
was
they owned.
never really about
Others
the
had
machine.
nothing at all.
The answer was
As the
about
gangway
perspective.
lowered, a
About
strange silence
assumptions.
settled over the group.
About the distance
This
between
was the
what
moment
people are
they
told
had feared,
and what they eventually
the moment
discover
they had
for
imagined
themselves.
countless times.
And perhaps that lesson
Several women
remains
later
relevant
admitted
today,
they believed
because
imprisonment
every
would be only
generation
the beginning.
inherits stories
They expected
about other people,
insults,
other
interrogations,
nations, other
perhaps
cultures,
worse,
other
one
enemies.
woman quietly
Sometimes
crossed
those
herself.
stories are
Another
accurate.
squeezed a photograph
Sometimes
hidden
they are
inside her coat
incomplete.
pocket.
Sometimes
A third
they are
stared toward the
entirely
dock
wrong
and whispered a
The
prayer.
challenge is finding the
gangway
courage
touched
to look
the pier.
beyond them.
The journey
To question,
was over.
to observe,
or perhaps something
to
entirely
understand.
new was about
The
to
German
begin.
women who arrived in
American
America
military
in 1945
personnel
waited
expected
below.
one reality
The women
and encountered
froze.
another.
Their
that
hearts
experience
pounded.
did not erase
Boots
the horrors
echoed
of
against
war.
the metal ramp
It did
as the
not
first
undo
prisoners
years
slowly
of suffering.
descended.
But
The
it
harbor
reminded
wind
them
whipped
of
through
something
their hair.
important. Nobody
Even
knew
during
what would
humanity's
happen
darkest
next.
conflicts,
Then
reality
something
is often more
unexpected
complicated than fear
Nobody
allows us
shouted.
to believe.
Nobody
And
struck
perhaps
them.
that is why this
Nobody
forgotten
cursed
story
them.
still matters
The Americans
today.
simply
Because
watched.
behind every
Calmly,
uniform is a human
professionally,
being. Behind
almost
every nation
indifferently,
are ordinary
the reaction
people.
confused
And behind
many
every
of the
war
women.
are
Fear does
this
not
was
vanish
not what they
because
have
of a
been
single
taught to
experience.
expect.
Distrust
Not even
does
close.
not evaporate
Yet
after
the
one
biggest surprise
conversation,
was still
but
waiting.
day by day,
Because after
observation
processing
by
and
observation,
registration,
assumption
the women
by
were
assumption,
escorted toward a
many
reception
began
building
seeing the
near
world
docks.
differently.
Inside,
the enemy no
the
longer
air felt
appeared
warm
as a
compared to
faceless
the bitter
monster.
cold outside.
The enemy became
the smell
human,
hit them immediately.
and perhaps that was
Fresh
the greatest
coffee,
surprise of all.
soap,
Because
clean
war
fabric,
depends heavily
food,
on distance.
simple smells,
Distance between
ordinary
nations.
smells,
Distance
but to
between
people who had
cultures.
lived through years of war,
Distance between
they felt
people.
almost unreal.
The greater the distance,
Some women
the easier
exchanged
it
nervous
becomes to
glances.
simplify others.
Others stared
to
at
fear
the floor,
them, to hate them, to misunderstand them. But when people finally meet face to face, reality often becomes more complicated than propaganda ever allowed. The German women were not heroes. The Americans were not perfect. History is rarely that simple. World War II remains one of the most devastating conflicts in human history. Tens of millions lost their lives. Entire cities disappeared. Families were destroyed. Communities were shattered. The suffering reached nearly every corner of the globe. Nothing about that reality should be minimized. Yet within enormous historical events, smaller human stories still matter. Stories that reveal how individuals experienced history. Stories that show how ordinary people navigated extraordinary circumstances. Stories that remind us that large events are ultimately made up of countless personal moments. It is story of March 1945,
a misunderstanding,
New York Harbor,
a discovery,
a cold Atlantic
vending
wind
machine,
swept across the docks
small
before
moments
sunrise.
can sometimes reveal
Dark
larger
clouds
truths.
hung low over the
For the
water.
women who stood
The harbor
inside that
smelled of
reception
salt,
building
diesel
in
fuel,
1945,
wet wood,
the
and
machine
coal
represented
smoke
more
drifting
than
from
convenience.
distant ships.
It represented the
groaned
collapse
through the
of
morning
assumptions.
fog. The beginning of questions.
Seagulls
The realization
overhead,
that reality could
and
differ
slowly,
dramatically
through the
from
gray mist,
expectation.
a transport
and
ship
that realization
approached the pier.
stayed with many
Few
of them
people
long
on the dock
after the war
paid
ended.
much attention.
Eventually,
Thousands
most
of military
returned
vessels
home,
had arrived
but
here
home
during
had
the war.
changed. This
Germany
one seemed
itself
no
had
different.
changed.
But
Countless
this was not
individuals
what they
simply
had
trying
been
to
taught
survive.
expect. In the end,
Not even
the
close.
strange object that
Yet the
confused
biggest
those
surprise
women was
was
never the
still
most
waiting.
remarkable part of the
Because
story.
after processing
the most
and
remarkable
registration,
part was what
the
they
women
learned
were escorted
after
toward a
asking the
reception
question.
building near
If
the
you
docks.
enjoyed this hidden World
Inside,
War II story,
the air felt warm
please like,
compared to the
subscribe,
bitter cold outside.
and join us for more forgotten
the smell
stories
hit
from
them
history.
immediately. Fresh coffee, soap, clean fabric, food, simple smells, ordinary smells. But to people who had lived through years of war, they felt almost unreal. Some women exchanged nervous glances. Others stared at the floor.